Last week in Australia, there was a big piece of news. In an interview with a journalist, the Chinese Ambassador Cheng Jingye was said to have threatened Australia that if Australia insists on investigating China on the coronavirus issue, then China would launch a trade boycott against Australia. Now that caused a big sensation, a lot of negative reaction, especially coming from some politicians. I, like many Australians, was dismayed. How can that happen? A couple of days later, I saw a short interview of Jane Colley. Now, Jane Colley is the director of Australian Centre on China of ANU, ANU being Australian National University. Ms. Colley said that she had gone through the transcript of the interview and could find no evidence of a threat against Australia. Her views echo that of Professor Jocelyn Chey. Professor Jocelyn Chey is a professor of several universities in Sydney. She said in an article, and among other things, that, I quote, "The ambassador was cornered by a leading question, and we should look at the entire statement and not take one remark out of context." I have since obtained a copy of the transcript myself. The closest thing to what the ambassador was accused of saying, and that was after numerous promptings from the interviewer. He said that, quote, "In the long term, for example, I think if the mood is going from bad to worse, people would think why we should go to such a country while it's not so friendly to China." Notice that statement is not about the coronavirus. It is about what might happen if we are unfriendly to each other. Now, if someone says to us, "Don't keep running in the middle of the road, you may get run over by a car." Now, that is not a threat, that is an advice, a concern of our well-being. It is not a threat. Now, in that interview, the reporter continued to prod the ambassador for a more definitive answer. And he got it. Listen very carefully to this next question. "So, a boycott of Australia?" he asked the ambassador, and the ambassador replied, "I don't know. I hope not." Now, why did that turn into something quite opposite? But my disappointment went even further. In that long interview, the ambassador actually said a lot of very positive things. They never get to see the light of day. Why? This incident reminds me of the tremendous responsibility society has vested in our media, because media forms opinions. They shape public opinions, they shape how the politicians think, and therefore they shape Australia's policies and towards itself and towards the rest of the world, and therefore it shapes Australia's future. Since that interview of the Chinese ambassador, I have seen many other journalists jumping into the bandwagon and feeding on each other, accusing the ambassador and China of intimidation. I urge them to please check the facts. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on the journalists. I have been a journalist myself. Journalists are human too. You know, they get influenced by other journalists, they get influenced by politicians, and in turn they influence the rest of the community. Unfortunately, some journalists, they start to have a fixed mindset, and they ceased to be objective. And they may actually actively seek out stories that befits their persuasion, or even seek out targets of interviewees to befit their persuasion. I'm not referring to that interview, I'm talking about generally. Now you may remember this. Not long ago, a government department said that their computer was hacked. Now we all know that when a computer is hacked, it's very hard to trace who did it, because some very clever people can even make it as if it was coming from a certain direction, which is not. Fair enough. But someone came out and said, oh, I suspect it was China. Fair enough. I can suspect my neighbor damaged my car. Why? Because he always has that sneaky look on his face. Because I don't like him, or because he doesn't like me because I don't like him, or for other reasons. Fair enough. But if a journalist was confronted by that remark, I think, I believe, or I suspect it was China, what is the first question that comes into your mind? The most fundamental question. Why did you suspect China? But if the journalist already has a fixed mindset that he or she agrees or is of the same persuasion as the person who was suspecting, then he or she may say something like, oh, what is Australia going to do about it? And that was what I observed. I want to raise another example. Some time ago, an Australian military plane was targeted by lasers in the South China Sea. It was a very fair report when it came out. It says that that was not military-grade laser, and it might have come from one of hundreds of ships or boats, fishing boats in that area. Fair enough, it was a good report. Several months later, when someone was giving examples of undesirable activities from China, that was quoted as if it was proven that it came from China. Now, I may be wrong, I might have missed a report here and there, but think about it. That Australian plane has already gone back to base. All the fishing boats have dispersed and gone home. All the laser beams have gone off to deep space. Is it possible that a few months down the track we still can say a particular laser beam came from a Chinese vessel? I don't think so. Now, some journalists may even go further than that to get their stories. They may even create their own story. I once watched on television a journalist in China, in Xinjiang, China, and I saw him deliberately aggravating a guard to get an angry face onto his camera. Now, that is not fair reporting. Now, don't misunderstand me. I will affirm that most journalists are fair and dedicated, but a few are not. And if that few were relied upon to get us a true and accurate report, I would worry, won't you? I'm a migrant of 50 years, or over 50 years, I've stopped counting. I consider myself a loyal migrant. And I think migrants are like adopted children. They are naturally loyal to their adoptive parent because they have become a citizen on their own volition. But if a migrant is a fair, a passionate, and a loyal person, we would expect that he or she would retain some attachment to their birth parent. That does not diminish their loyalty to this country. But it would be very sad for this person if he sees his adoptive parent continuously, persistently poking the side of his birth parent. We live in a very complex world. No country is entirely bad and no country is entirely good. If we can just keep an open mind, we will be more able to see and report a clearer picture. Only a few days ago, Dr. Stephen Fitzgerald, Australia's first ambassador to China, was reported saying by senior journalist Deborah Snow. He said, there is a very, very strong anti-China push coming from certain agencies in Canberra. And it is simply ideological, he said. In my view, it is mindless in terms of our overall interests. End of quote. Now, I too genuinely believe that some segments of the Australian media is a bit overzealous in their suspicion, in their prejudice against China. And it is doing damage to justice, doing damage to the Australia-China relations, and doing damage to Australia's future. And please, I don't want that to be interpreted as a threat to anyone.